Imagine a world where governments spend more than they earn, every single year. Now imagine that this has been happening for decades. What began as short-term borrowing has become a permanent addiction. In 2025, the global economy faces the consequences of this behavior. A staggering $313 trillion in global debt, according to the Institute of International Finance. That's not a typo. It's more than 330% of total global GDP. To put that in perspective, for every $1 the world produces, there's more than $3 owed. This isn't just dangerous. It's unprecedented. In the United States, the national debt has now surpassed $35.3 trillion as of Q1 2025. That's over 122% of GDP. In Japan, public debt exceeds 260% of GDP. In Italy, 144%. France, nearly 112%. And it's not just developed economies. Emerging markets like Egypt, Argentina, and Pakistan are struggling to make basic interest payments. Why does this matter? Because debt is no longer cheap. From 2009 to 2021, interest rates were at historic lows. Governments borrowed freely, assuming they could refinance endlessly. But since 2022, central banks around the world have raised rates sharply to fight inflation. In the US, the Federal Reserve pushed rates to 5.25%, the highest in over 20 years. The European Central Bank followed suit, reaching 4.5% by late 2024. This changes everything. Servicing debt has become expensive, very expensive. In 2025, the US government is projected to spend over $1.2 trillion just on interest payments. That's more than the entire annual defense budget. And it's nearly double what the government spends on education. This isn't just unsustainable. It's a ticking bomb. Globally, the cost of borrowing is pushing countries into crisis mode. Pakistan is negotiating its 24th bailout from the IMF. Argentina faces inflation of over 180% and defaults again. In sub-Saharan Africa, debt service already consumes more than 40% of national budgets in over a dozen countries. And here's the real problem: much of this debt is short-term. Governments rely on constantly rolling over bonds, borrowing new money to pay back old. But if investor confidence drops, interest rates spike, and suddenly that cycle is broken. We saw this in the UK in 2022. When Prime Minister Liz Truss announced unfunded tax cuts, investors panicked. Bond yields surged. The British pound collapsed to record lows. And the Bank of England had to step in with emergency bond buying to stabilize the market. That was a warning. And it was just one country. In 2025, similar stress is showing in bond markets from Italy to India. Japan's central bank, long committed to ultra-low yields, was forced to intervene multiple times to contain bond volatility. The Japanese yen has lost over 20% of its value in just 18 months. Meanwhile, in the US, concerns over Treasury auctions are mounting. In February 2025, a 10-year bond auction saw record low demand from foreign buyers, especially China and Japan. This pushed yields up sharply, triggering a wave of concern across Wall Street. Why are foreign buyers pulling back? Because they no longer trust the US to control its spending. Because inflation erodes the real value of bonds. Because debt ceilings are raised every year. Because political gridlock makes real fiscal reform nearly impossible. And because, increasingly, the world sees that the emperor may have no clothes. This is the confidence game, and when trust disappears, debt becomes dangerous. When countries borrow too much, markets don't just correct, they punish. Bond markets are not patient. They don't wait for elections or reforms. They react in real time. The result? A potential spiral. Higher borrowing costs, right pointing arrow, more debt, right pointing arrow, lower confidence, right pointing arrow, even higher borrowing costs. This is the textbook definition of a debt trap. In 2025, we are dangerously close to that tipping point. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes loudly. We've seen the damage that unsustainable debt can cause. In the 1980s, Latin America experienced a devastating debt crisis. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina borrowed heavily from international banks, until interest rates in the US soared under Paul Volcker. Debt service costs exploded. Dozens of nations defaulted. Entire generations saw their economies crumble. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis began in Thailand. A single failed currency peg led to a cascade. Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, all suffered deep recessions. Billions in capital fled overnight. The IMF stepped in, but not without pain, austerity, unemployment, and political upheaval. In 2008, the global financial crisis was triggered not by government debt, but by private leverage. Still, the result was the same: banks failed, markets collapsed, and once again, governments were forced to borrow massively to save the system. Between 2008 and 2022, the world added over $100 trillion in new debt, just to stabilize what had already been broken. And now, in 2025, we're facing something even more dangerous: not a crisis from too much private speculation, but from governments themselves becoming the weakest link. The irony? Many of these governments still rely on central banks to save them. But that lifeline is fading. In the past, when markets wobbled, central banks responded with quantitative easing, buying bonds, pushing rates down, flooding the system with liquidity. But QE has limits. Since 2022, central banks have been fighting inflation, not deflation. Printing more money today doesn't calm markets, it stokes prices. And in a high inflation world, printing leads to one thing: currency debasement. We're already seeing signs. In 2024, the Turkish lira lost over 40% of its value. In Nigeria, the naira collapsed. In Lebanon, years of fiscal mismanagement ended in hyperinflation and financial collapse. In Europe, inflation remains stubborn, hovering near 4.2%. Germany is now debating whether to suspend its debt brake to fund industrial policy and energy subsidies. This is the trap: high inflation blocks central banks from printing their way out. And high interest costs trap governments in a tightening fiscal noose. Markets are beginning to price in sovereign stress, not just from fringe economies, but from core ones. The U.S. Treasury market is flashing warning signs. Volatility in long-term bond yields has surged. Bid-to-cover ratios in auctions are falling. Foreign demand is shrinking. China's holdings of U.S. Treasuries have dropped below $800 billion. Japan is selling, too. If these trends continue, borrowing costs will rise, even during recessions. And that undermines governments' ability to respond to the next crisis. If the US wobbles, the entire global system shakes. Because the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency. And if trust in the dollar falls, the global system loses its anchor. We are nearing the edge of a systemic transition, from abundant debt and blind trust to scarcity and fear. So what could go wrong? Scenario 1. Sovereign defaults. Countries like Pakistan or Egypt default, triggering investor flight. Contagion spreads. Banks suffer. Markets panic. Scenario 2. Bond market panic. Investors flee US or EU debt. Yields spike. Currencies fall. Stock markets collapse. Central banks can't stop it without triggering inflation. Scenario 3. Central bank paralysis. Inflation is high. Growth is low. Political pressure mounts. They cut rates, but markets lose confidence. Stagflation takes hold. In every case, ordinary people suffer: job losses, shrinking pensions, tighter credit, instability. But there is hope, for those who prepare. Smart investors in 2025 are already taking action, holding real assets, diversifying globally, building cash reserves, cutting bad debt, and using AI tools to monitor systemic risk in real time. Top AI tools include Kensho, Dataminr, Predata, and Bloomberg GPT. They track macro data, political risk, and even the tone of central bank speeches. This isn't science fiction, it's modern financial defense. The global debt bomb may not explode tomorrow, but it's ticking. The question is, are you prepared? If you found this video valuable, hit subscribe for more deep dive content on global markets, AI, and intelligent investing. Like and share to help others stay informed, before it's too late. This video is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not financial advice. Always consult a certified financial advisor before making investment decisions. All data is current as of April 2025.